Okay, I'm extremely honored for a number, actually, not just to be invited here, but also that we got this, whatever you want to call it, yesterday, that was completely unexpected, from refugee. So in that sense, it's especially nice to see that. But I I must say that when you invited me, I said that I would do something, but that I had been working on already. I'm not going to propose something new. I had to send this paper, more or less, for a conference that was in Mexico, online, at the end of March. And my opinion hasn't changed that much because we updated the data there, thanks to Guillermo, and updated it. And really, yeah, it's changed a little bit, from then, because we updated it, meaning we put in 2022 there, the first 6 months as well as we're going to see for certain data, or 20 in the case of some other data, whatever was available, the latest. So just to kind of, but it's really a kind of, what do you want to call it? It's an empirical, somewhat empirical, with some ideas. There's no pretense that it's a new theory of anything or breaking the frontiers of knowledge of anything, but it's an attempt to come to grips with what has been happening and to sort of come up with some both stylized facts and some possible theoretical analysis of what in fact has been happening, okay? Because it's extremely puzzling, some of the stuff that has been happening. And we'll see why in a minute. Now, yeah, I was invited. I mean, I've been thinking about this for a while because we got a project going on with INET, and that was one of the things I had mentioned there as well. But it was only in January when I was invited by Elisa Guillon to speak at UNAM, the conference, that I, started working a little bit on that. And, really, at the time, I must say, I mean, until, let's say, certainly until January, I would argue, central banks in particular were not, well, they were concerned, obviously they have to be, that's their mandate kind of thing, but they thought that the inflation would be some sort of temporary phenomenon. So in fact, when you look at the interest rate policy, there was absolutely no change. They stuck through it until the beginning of 2022. And then it became a hysteria in a sense, after they started seeing increases, much of it, in fact, I mean, especially because of the Ukrainian situation, that kind of really led to a huge jump in oil prices and all that, which were going already before, but not to that extent. Then it turned out to be, as I said, they really reversed. We see a complete U-turn here in the what was the policy view, both on the fiscal and monetary policy, by the way. The only difference with the fiscal policy is that while they were now gearing towards austerity, we're cutting back on the deficit dramatically. Canada, particularly, run huge deficits in 2020, but then very quickly brought it down. And it's now part of that was just natural thing going on because of higher growth. But nonetheless, there was this attempt until the Ukrainian war again, because then you're trying to get up more for military spending and all that, and that sort of, somewhat mitigating that tendency. But since March, what we see is a huge jump in the interest rates and all that. I mean, really a very dramatic increase. Some people say, yeah, it's only 340%, which is true. It's not that, a la Pavinetti, it's still too low kind of thing, right? But at the same time, it's a huge jump in a period of 6 months. That had never, in fact, there was a study done that which showed that we have never seen a huge jump in the interest rates that much without engineering some sort of recession. Okay, so and I think that's what's happening anyways. Okay, in the U.S. it was not as dramatic, but we'll see soon with the new Fed, federal funds rate. So it's important to see this now. What we're seeing, therefore, is this attempt to apply some sort of austerity here. And part of that, okay, is because there's this belief that we've now really hit full employment kind of situation. in these countries. In Canada as well, you hear it everywhere, from the central bank, from all these policy analysts. You hear that we have extremely tight labor market situation, okay? And that's what we wanted to explore. Now, what I'm going to do first, though, is to give you a bit of a historical kind of overview, okay, of what happened. And we have to, if we put it in a historical perspective, it's not so easy to conclude some of that, as we'll see in a minute, okay? But let's look at what I call some stylized facts for Canada, at least. You could do that for the US. It's not that different, Now, what we could see here, I go back 75 and a half years, because of the 6 months of 2022, okay? So it's over 75 years, 3/4 of that, of the evolution of both the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, okay? CPI, the standard one. And what we see is some interesting phenomena here. The first thing on the inflation front, you see some really dramatic fluctuations, a lot of, see these high amplitudes literally, okay, right after the Second World War, okay? And this has a lot to do with the tremendous dislocations that were going on, with troops coming back. I mean, this whole kind of situation where they're getting, gearing up now for no longer a real economy kind of environment, but to peacetime kind of, and there was a whole problem of what we're facing even now into supply chains, bottlenecking and all this kind of stuff. What's going on there? Exactly the same kind of thing. Okay? And you see this huge inflation rate. And then, of course, as you could see, it kind of, once things stabilized right after the war, the inflation, there was the Korean War, which is a bit of a bump there, but if not, things got down, stayed pretty stable until, again, when was it? The disruptions in the 1970s there with the oil price shocks and all that. Okay? We see this huge jump in the inflation rate. Then this inflation comes back down, and indeed, as you can see, it's been, this is what the central bank goes around saying that it's proud of saying, but it's all because of them, which I think is a little bit of baloney here, but it's certainly, they certainly were a factor in this whole thing. And guess when? Until we get to well, not to the pandemic, because initially we had a kind of almost deflation in 2020, but then it ended up, leading to, in 2021, we start seeing, rising inflation. And then in 2022, it's kind of exploded in a sense, okay? But all of this, again, is during periods of significant dislocation, significant restructuration, whatever you want to call it, that is going on. And that also you'll see it in the labor market. We'll get that later. But the point being that if you look at it over a long historical period, for a country, for an industrial, whatever you want to call a country like Canada, okay, the general tendency is for low inflation, except during periods of disruption. So that's the reality. Okay. What about the unemployment rate instead? Okay. Well, the unemployment rate, as you could see, it's interesting. It used to be like down as low as almost 2% here. Okay, in the 40s. Okay, and 50s like 2.5%, 3%. And then it stayed relatively low, except during certain periods, like in the late 50s, early 60s, where we had a recession. Yeah. But if not, it was a normal thing until, again, the 1970s, there was a big jump. And guess what? It went up, but it pretty much stayed up. Okay. I mean, that came down a little bit, but nowhere back to the levels, that we used to see in the 40s and 50s and 60s even, I would say. Okay. So there's a kind of discontinuous jump. Okay. And again, we must try to figure out what the heck happened there. So, I mean, I just summarized here what was going on. So what I'm saying here is that there is this kind of almost long run, I call it decipherable here in the sense that it seems to be what's the, visually what you see there in a sense, superficially, which is this kind of long run inverse relation between inflation and employment, okay? But at the same time, what we could see here is that there's no simple, there's no inverse relationship here in this. If you look at it in the short run, I'm not going to go back to the graph there, but you will see that sometimes it's positively related, sometimes it's negatively related. It's all over the map. If you did a scatter diagram, it would look more like a blob there. It wouldn't be so easy to conclude that. Okay? But if you look at it in terms of long historical periods, you tend to see this kind of relationship. So as I was saying here, it goes all over the map. Yeah, you cannot conclude that it's like the old Phillips curve kind of thing, at all. Now, what we have seen, therefore, over this whole 75 and a half period, 75-year period, is that except for these fluctuations, small, the cyclical fluctuations here, the long-term behavior of the unemployment rate shows what I call the ratchet effect. It just jumped up and stayed pretty much up, and it took a long time to decline, despite the fact that we see, growth that kind of establishing itself. Okay, and what in a sense happens is that except for some major shock on the demand side, I mean, we saw this, well, we didn't have data going way back there, but during the Great Depression, what ended it was the war, in a sense. It was another shock on the demand side that ultimately brought down what otherwise would have been a long-term kind of high unemployment, stagnant system once again. Okay, and I think this is important to understand, that you got this kind of hysteresis sort of phenomenon almost for the unemployment rate. Okay, even though the inflation rate, will start to either rise or fall, you won't see the unemployment rate going exactly that way at all. Okay, now what about trying to make sense of the theories here? Okay, what can we possibly understand about these stylized, what I call them, theories about what is going on here? Well, I mean, I'm not going to tell you this. I mean, everybody knows what until the global financial crisis, everybody pretty much believed there's some sort of natural rate of unemployment hypothesis. There wasn't any question. All the inflation targeting was, in a sense, based on this idea that there was a sort of, natural rate, either a natural rate of interest or natural rate of unemployment. They somehow put them together, even though they're not theoretically the same thing at all. But somehow they kind of, there's a confluence of views here that kind of got together and clustered around inflation targeting and all that. And that became the norm. And there was obviously some rather important evidence that clearly questioned these theories. Okay, and even though that was the case, that we see a decline in unemployment, especially after the global financial crisis. What's interesting is that you start only after then, you start seeing people raising questions significantly, questions about the validity of that standard theory. We see, I just mentioned one here, Blanchard here, for instance, where he talks about the breakdown, that was the end of the accelerationist curse, he calls it, it's a curse on our profession. Okay? And indeed, what we start seeing is a number of economists. I mentioned one here, Chrysler and Lavoie here, just to highlight the fact that they wrote a paper which they talked about, a flat, but it's pretty, it's something that many in the heterodox community would be, comfortable with, in a sense. Everybody, would have, subscribed to that view. And historically, there were many going back really to the early 1960s. I could give you some references there of economists who questioned this sort of Phillips curve thing, which was a bit of an aberration statistically. The way the whole thing was calculated by, I'm not going to go into all that here, but I'm just saying here that this is something that was questioned before. But there were also a lot of studies. I just mentioned some here. This from the New York Fed, this one, the legal, whatever, they that find the same kind of flat thing. But you got it even from the horse's mouth. You're talking about Janet Yellen there, where she was defending the idea that we've now got a flat Phillips curve, So I mean, it's something that became really established almost. Okay? But it's amazing. to go from a vertical one to a horizontal one, you know? You would think somehow you got to get your mind, I don't know how it's screwed up there because I can't, it's not easy to reconcile these things. Okay? You would say, okay? And obviously you get this kind of flat Phillips curve, but with only these sort of the edges, and I could go, I could get even deflation at one extreme or the other one that it could kind of shoot up there at some point. Okay? But there's a wide range, okay? Where no matter what happened to unemployment or demand in the economy or growth, it did not impact at all. It gets stuck at that norm, and and that's it, and until you get some really major shock. Okay? And indeed, the only way for that curve to rise is when you get some kind of supply shock here, whether it would be like oil prices, as we saw like in the 70s, for instance, or of course, because the wage norm, because of the breakdown in the way, collective bargaining, whatever, there could be conditions as we're starting to see right now, the way I see it. But then you get into this kind of wage price spiraling as well. There is such a thing that could happen. We were debating yesterday about that, but it's clear that, when things destabilize, then you could have the shifting of it. Okay? But it's because of what I would call supply side factors. On the demand side, you're never going to see this kind of thing going up or down. Okay? So it looks, I've written a bit about this here in certain papers, and even with this thing for INET that we put together, that highlights this fact, which is that this relationship was for fairly long. If you look at historically, literally for about 40 years or 30 years, I would say at least, even before they started doing inflation targeting in this country, it kind of got anchored close to that 2%. But it then became officialized through the inflation target because it established itself almost like a norm in the, remember, all the issue of the central bank is about credibility and how they could somehow embed these expectations of inflation, that the central bank is credible at that 2% norm. Okay, so in that sense, it is. This is what you could see happening. It's a kind of income policy, as I said, where they're trying to provide guideposts, if you wish, in this case, in the realm of collective bargaining in particular. And therefore, as I said, even though you're going to get growth, it did not lead to this kind of thing. But I want you to take note of these 2 points here. Okay, these specific unemployment rates. On the theoretical plane. These are important because I'm going to associate this now with the Beveridge full employment situation that we're supposedly reached or gone further even. Okay, versus what I call I would call veritable full employment. Now we'll get to exactly what this means later. But it's important to see that it's going to be different than this one, than the Beveridge one, which many in the U.S. is Nicolay and what do they say? They've been writing a lot about this. They're trying to argue that we're way over that right now, which is true. If you look at the data for the U.S., there's some, we're over the part of the. We'll get to that because I have the data there. But it's important to understand here that these two are of some critical importance. We're going to see in terms of what I got to say about it. Okay. Yeah, I'll get lots. It's all what I said here. But what's important here is that this kind of bias in the policy realm, okay, just to oops, wrong. Yeah, in the policy realm, if you were like in the 1990s, let's say, or early 2000, before the global financial crisis, and you're the central banker, okay. You still have in your brain this idea that we're in some sort of vertical Phillips curve, okay? Then what's happening? And what would happen is that they will, so if you're here, they don't, they fear that you shouldn't accelerate growth too much because it's going to lead to inflation right away. Even though we could see perfectly well there that if it is flat, this is not going to happen. So the bias is always going to be closer towards U2 rather than to U1, just simply because what they have in their brain and what is reality are obviously there's a disconnect there. And indeed, this is, as I said, is what you see. So they're going to keep unemployment rate as high as they can here, okay? Despite the fact that inflation rate did not really change at all. And it was well anchored, almost as they call it there, at that 2% level. Okay, so you got this policy bias here. Now, so what we see is during that whole year, of course, of austerity, both on the fiscal and the monetary side, at least in Canada here, absolutely. Okay, very tight, both on the fiscal side, on the monetary side. Okay, and of course, the only time that you see a significant change was during the global financial crisis, where they gave up, you know, the sort of austerity thing there. They started running deficits, despite themselves, their own ideology, because we had a conservative government then, and clearly he had to kind of put a spoon feed it to him that you got to run a deficit now in 2008, because otherwise we may end up really facing difficulties, and we did. But he was, Canada and Germany were the only two countries who had agreed in 2010 at the G20 meeting, who had all agreed at the time to run these, to run deficits, but then go back to balanced budgets by 2015. And Canada and Germany were the only countries that did, at the time, in reality. Okay, but it came from this sort of need to run deficits, so they became more credible. Okay, and the same thing, of course, in terms of monetary policy, it became the principal instrument of macroeconomic policy. And what we see, of course, is in terms of interest rates here, they cut them just like they did recently during the pandemic. Same kind of thing, hit the bottom, and it stayed for a while, then kind of just mildly went up, but not very much. It stayed down for a long time. Okay, now, of course, with COVID, needless to say, there's a big shock here. Unemployment jumps up. Okay, now for two reasons. Obviously, one was literally because demand shrunk. Consumption spending declined dramatically. The saving rate went through the roof. And at the same time, also because there were programmed kind of increases in the unemployment rate, just purely for pandemic kind of health kind of related reasons here. They closed down, locked down certain sectors where it could spread more quickly. So this is what happened in 2020 and then in early 2021. But you also, of course, see that inflation started to rise in 2021, but in 2020 it actually collapsed. Okay, it was way below the norm, below the range. Okay, so all of that to say that all of this happened there. Now, my point about this is simply to say that the actual, the high unemployment that was characteristic of that whole period, okay, was really not necessary, I would argue, to get that inflation rate down, because it has a rather quite independent relationship vis-a-vis that. Okay, and it's important to see how this happened. But now this brings me to the important thing of what I want to show you. This is a kind of stuff I remember as an undergraduate, when I took a course in labor economics. They used to have, it was mostly micro stuff for labor economics, as it still is. Now it's almost all micro. Okay, but then they used to have a chapter at the end of macro analysis. And guess what was the macro of labor economics? There was a Phillips curve, and there was the UV relationship. They never even called it then the Beveridge curve until later. Okay? But it is this relationship, and I think most of you are familiar with the idea, which is simply that obviously as demand grows, if you're on some kind of relationship like this one, then if demand grows, so you get unemployment, it will be associated with growing vacancies, and it will be non-linear, basically. Okay, Now we can get into the details of how it works in terms of the hires and the recalls versus the quits and everything else, and how this can impact on these vacancies. But we're going to try to connect it now vis-a-vis the points that I was mentioning earlier, if you recall, from that Phillips curve. Okay, and you could see here there's a 45-degree line that cuts this Beveridge curve, where the U equals V. Okay, where the two are equal. And this we'll call it the Beveridge full employment. Now, Beveridge himself, he wrote this book in 1944, which basically argued that he thought the full employment would be where either vacancies are equal or greater, by the way, than the number of unemployed. Now, the problem is how you define them and everything, which is not so easy, especially, excuse me, in the case of vacancies and all that. But the point being that he had this kind of definition, which became, for someone, you're going to see the goal literally, okay? Because at least it's something you can anchor to, if you have that information. But obviously, you could get to what I'll call more like veritable full employment when it becomes, not quite vertical there, but it's getting very much, closer to that vertical, because it only touches it asymptotically there, okay? So, and moreover, importantly, is that obviously if you have growing problems of mismatching, whether it's regional, industrial, occupation, whatever, then you're going to have a shift in that relationship. So you could have both more vacancies and more unemployed if there's just no matching going on, okay? And that's why if you get the shift, you can still get full employment, but it will be more structural unemployment, let's say, associated with that, level, okay? And we'll still call it a full employment, okay? Now, let's look at it empirically, what happened, okay? And if there's any problems, blame the Emily here, because we put it together, we got the data. Thanks to him there, he pulled it up. What we have here, that whole period, I don't have it going back to the 1940s, because in Canada, they calculate, it wasn't even vacancy rates as they calculate them now. They use the help wanted index. It was called. I won't get into the detail. We don't have time to go through all that. But there's a help wanted index, even in the US, which goes back to 1951. They started it. So they're able to get these series all the way back to there, and then construct it and then link it up with the current vacancies where they overlap and so on. So it's just this kind of linkage here, bricolage, as we say in French, and try to put them all together. Okay? And that is important to notice here because, as you can see here, it's too bad that a person like Andrew Sharp, who's a colleague of ours, a good friend of ours, who's the director of the Center for the Study of Living Standards, because I got it from him originally, the idea. Okay, in the 1980s, he wrote an article, a brochure that came out from when he was heading the Center for Labor Market and Productivity, or something like that. I can't remember the exact name. And I had, until I retired, I still had the copy. But I retired, I threw it all out because I was going to bring all that stuff in my home. I didn't have enough space for all this. After 40 years of accumulating stuff, that you just didn't, go. So, and I asked him if he had a copy, and he can't find any, so I cannot cite him directly. But here's the one it came up with the idea. So let's imagine, okay, that 1966, because we were looking for the 60s, what was the lowest point for the 1960s, not the 50s. Okay, let's imagine that was close to what we call more veritable, not veritable, called the Beveridge point, not the veritable. I want to be careful here. Okay, so this is the we were at the, I think we're at 100 here. Okay. This is the 1966 point. And then everything else is defined in relationship to that. So in the 1950s, especially, we see some of them that were even, further up there on the left side of the 45-degree line. But many of them are clustered in that direction. And then we got the 1970s. All the round things there, the 1970s, basically. Okay, and what's important to understand The last time that we got close to it for employment out of Beveridge this was in 1974. Yeah, the last time. And then, as you can see, we were still floating about there until we hit, this is approximately a 40-year period of X's here. Okay? All clustering. Okay? And then we got the pandemic data. Now, until 22, this is what we had. And for this first 6 months, so we don't have the year. This is all annual data, by the way, because that's how you could get it way back there. Okay? But the point being here is that when we see a number of things, yes, there are clusterings, but there are like 3 clusterings, you could say. Okay? Certainly 2 important ones. The others are either it's outliers or an aberration, but there's only 3 observations there you have to work with. But what we see is that there's a kind of shift here. Now, it is, because it's an index of the actual vacancy numbers, this, of course, you would expect if you had a kind of a Harvardian sort of Harrod's natural growth rate of an economy, this type of thing, then these things would kind of slowly, incrementally would be shifting up a bit. Okay? But that's not what we see here at all. What we see are discontinuous jumps, basically. Okay? And it happened, oh boy, yeah, usual problem. Okay, discontinuous jumps, okay? But anyway, just to finish here, so we see these clusterings, and there are a number of things to emphasize here, because they really, the way I see them, they reflect almost labor market states of the economy that they kind of hang on to there, because there's no reason why for 40 years it would be kind of gravitating around here. Okay? But more importantly, what we see, except for the 2022, which is getting close to the Beveridge full employment, okay? What we could see is that everything didn't just shift upwards, but it all kind of swung into problems of long-term effective demand, you would argue. Yeah, problems. That's all it is. Okay? Because it's just going to, as you can see, it's swinging off to the right, which is highly problematic for an economy. Second thing also is that you could see sort of problems of hysteresis here. Remember we said the earlier data on the unemployment rate that was kind of, it didn't come down here usually. Okay? And it's the same thing here. Also, the slope, another observation to take note of, the slope, as you can see here, is interesting. Because what you're seeing here, this is a relatively flat slope. Okay? It means that for a small jump in vacancies, it led to a fairly big reduction. It's an increase in a reduction in unemployment. Okay? But it's getting steeper all the time. Okay? Now this was a little flat, but it's almost the same kind of slope as the other one. It got a lot steeper. And I think it has to do with these hysteresis kind of effects, because even if you're going to raise vacancies, it would be more difficult to get that unemployment rate down, despite the fact that it was actually, it should have been easier. Because if you have more spending in an economy, in a world where both the growth rate, the natural rate of growth, that is the labor force growth, and the productivity growth was actually coming down. So all of the things equal, you would have said, well, it's a lot easier, yet it was more difficult. Okay? So again, these are, now I had more to say here, obviously, a lot more, but is it? Okay, well, this is for the US, actually. It's interesting, okay? You can see for the US that it actually swung up to that side. I'll just say one other thing. I'm not going to get to the long-term and the income distribution part. I'm just going to leave that. But I'm be happy to send you what I did originally for the, it's in Spanish even now. So, but I could send it to you. I'd be happy to. Okay. But once, just go, yeah, this is the. Anyway, just to get back to these here. Now, even the US, I'll just say this and then I'll stop. Okay. There's a lot of word recently. I didn't know anything about it. When I got started last year, I had no idea that there was a lot of stuff going on in the US already about this. They're talking if you read some of the stuff that Macroeconomic, for instance, and so they argue that at the time, for instance, in 2021, there's an article that, in fact, some of the data for the US was pulled from their work. And what they have is, they argue that what we're actually seeing is that we are at the Beveridge full employment, and they call this the efficient unemployment point kind of thing, okay? So in a sense, they try to downgrade or reduce the importance of this unemployment, okay? Because if there are vacancies, that means, of course, they're getting choosier, in a sense, workers, okay? But let's put it in the context of the pandemic. A lot of these vacancies, there's a lot of vacancies, but they tend to be clustered, concentrated in sectors that nobody wants to work in. For reasons of fear of health, kind of concerns, healthcare is a good example, education, and most important, of course, in all the restaurants and all this sort of stuff in the services, nobody wants to work there. It's more difficult to find people, but not because they're being choosy for reasons that are just, we're waiting for the right reservation wage kind of arguments in terms of the standard mainstream view of it, but because they say, we're not going to work for these kind of wages, okay, to risk our lives, basically. Okay. So, but they argue that this is clearly we're at the super level of, and it's interesting that because I would argue because of the dual mandate, the U.S., they haven't reacted as badly, or I would call as strongly as the Bank of Canada has in dealing with it, in this problem of inflation, because in fact, Canada, as you could see, was not. We were still not at the Beveridge full employment even. Okay, we're still on the other, on the right side of our part or whatever. Okay, I'm stopping there. I'm sorry that took too long.